Good morning, everyone. My name is Catherine Wang. I'm one of the panelists for today. I will warn you in advance, this is a very awkwardly set up area, so we're probably going to be up walking around. The goal is to be as conversational as possible. We've got a lot of really important details and research that we want to share with you today, all related to supply chain, which you've heard a lot about yesterday and then today as well. So we're going to start out with a 30-second primer on each one of us, and then we'll kick off with Ron and Lucian to kind of walk us through the 50,000-foot view, and then so on and so forth. All right. Oh, okay. Sounds good. So good morning, everyone. My name is Catherine Wang. I am the CEO of a company called Control Alt Defeat. So we are specifically focused on sourcing the most innovative technologies that sit in the strategic intersection between cyber and physical defense in support of national security. Before I took this role, I spent 16 years at Google, so very much on the tech side of things, and then the past 6 years within application security in support of the DoD in cyber.
Hey guys, a lot of you have unknowingly been affected by either my cyber doctrine, my cyber methodologies, boundary protection mechanisms that we created with my Air Force team in the mid to late 90s. But I'm Ron Lewis. I'm best known as an application security pioneer. But if you ask me what keeps me up at night today, I'll tell you it's how code has moved from the digital domain into the physical realm, and the ease with which our enemies can affect the real world from code. And we're going to talk about that today.
Well, good morning. My name is Paul Lilly. I'm the CEO for Taj Quantum. Go figure, we're a cybersecurity company, just like I think about everyone else. So the basis for why I'm here, we've been working with the military for several years now in a number of areas for prevention of disruption of capability through using blockchain authentication, post-quantum encryption, but we also have been working with a number of devices, figuring out that there are counterfeit devices as well as compromised through malware devices that are just pervasive throughout our systems. My background is I was in intelligence, both Green and Blue Badger. I've also been an executive at Lockheed Martin for about 15 years before going to Agility and then spinning out my own company from there, which I've been doing since about 2018. My goal is just to share the information and intelligence that we've gathered over the past year, specifically around some very interesting things. I will be poking my finger in the eye of a few folks, just none of you in the room, thankfully. But it is just to share sort of the breadth of knowledge we've gained over the past year and some things that we can do quickly to maybe prevent serious problems. With that, Lucian.
Yeah, absolutely. So of the panelists here, I am the least technically competent, so I take their brilliance and turn it into policy. So I'm Lucian Niemeyer. I'm an Air Force vet, common engineer. Spent 11 years on the Senate Armed Services Committee professional staff. Does anybody remember a little operation called Buckshot Yankee? That was 2008. That ultimately spawned the beginning of Cybercom, and a lot of white folks in this room are here. So that was a Russian infiltration of our networks here, discovered in 2007, 2008. I was on the committee staff when we stood up Cybercom. I then ultimately transitioned over to the Department of Defense, where I served as the Assistant Secretary of Defense for all global facilities, energy, and environmental programs for all DoD. At that point is when I got directly ordered by then Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis to get after the OT threat. And we're going to talk specifically about OT, operational technology threat, not just within the Department of Defense, but also society writ large. So then Secretary Mattis asked me personally to take this on. It has now become a passion of mine since I started it. Spent a lot of time in NSA, got the crap scared out of me. I'm going to scare the crap out of you today about why we need to be paying attention to this. But since then, I've been working on solutions. So now, when I left federal service, I ended up serving as Assistant Secretary of the Navy and then ultimately in the White House at OMB, driving national security policy. Now I took that work and I run a national nonprofit called buildingcybersecurity.org, really focusing the attention on the private sector to the emerging OT threat that we face as a nation and everything we have, our cars, our homes, our buildings, our infrastructure. That is what we're going to talk about today. And I also am doing some other consulting. But for us today, the focus is going to be on the OT domain. So did you want to run through some logistics, or you just want to go ahead and get started?
I mean, it's pretty pretty basic. Just please, we want to keep this interactive, so we're going to be throwing a lot at you, but encourage you to reach out or raise your hand. Let's have a dialogue here. Other than that, I don't think there are anything else.
Yeah, we don't have slides, so no death by PowerPoint today. And I think we all talk pretty fast, so please slow us down, or if you have a comment or a question you want to make, we'll do that. All right. So we're going to start off with what I'm seeing at the very highest levels of government, and then we're going to get down to what does this mean for the folks in the room, and more importantly, is the expertise we have here is ultimately what can we do to address the OT and supply chain threat that we face as a nation that I believe is an existential threat, more compelling, I got to tell you, than anything I've heard yet here at my first day here at TechNet Augusta. I'm somewhat disappointed that we are not talking about the OT domain, the OT battle space. I got to tell you, if I had to redo Cybercom all over again, the last thing in the world that I want to protect is DOTA networks. To me, that's a relatively low priority. What I want to do is defend the homeland. And I want to defend the homeland from both an IT range of scenarios, but more importantly, as we add more devices to the internet every day, in every part of our life, we are becoming more vulnerable in what I call the OT battle space, all right, the OT domain. That cyber physical threat is really what we are focusing on. So when you have a hearing in the House of Representatives earlier this year where you have Director Wray talking about the existential risk to our physical security posed by a malware initiated by the Chinese. Anybody I'm hoping that's heard of Volt Typhoon? Is there anybody who doesn't know what Volt Typhoon is? All right, it's a Chinese malware, that's been in our systems, believe it or not, for years. Microsoft named it, but CrowdStrike feels that Vanguard Panda was also the other naming it years before that. But bottom line here, this is a malware that was not necessarily intended to be a traditional type of intrusion, which is predominantly intelligence, surveillance, or reconnaissance. This was intended to be a precursor to sabotage of our critical infrastructure systems in this country. All right? To me, that's a game changer. To me, this is the reason why these events are the reasons why we stand up entire combatant commands. So when I brought up Operation Yankee Buckshot, or Buckshot Yankee, it is because we are at that moment right now where we have adversaries in our wire. For anybody who's spending time in the military, particularly the Army, when you have an adversary in the wire, what's your top priority? Get them out of the wire, all right? Preserve, restore the security and safety of what you have. And that is what we have today. We have the Russians, just for the heck of it, playing around with our water systems in western Texas. Anybody familiar with the OT attack in Molshu? And it's not just there, but water systems around the country. When you have the Iranians, just for the heck of it, messing around with water controls in Aliquippa, Pennsylvania. Anybody familiar with that OT attack that happened recently? All right. These are the types of things where we're seeing our adversaries, nation states, in our systems. They are actually in our systems. What are we doing? Yeah.
That's specific about Volt Typhoon. I mean, one of the things that alarmed me about Volt Typhoon, and I'm going to turn back over to you, Racine, is the fact that this was a TTP, right? This was the development of a TTP, and it's not about China and their TTP. It's about creating a repeatable methodology that we're now seeing expanding across all of our adversaries. And that's when you mentioned the water treatment facility, the water treatment plant in West Texas. This terrifies me because it's now being amplified.
And we see risks. I mean, we're not just focused on China. I mean, Russia, Iran, North Korea, all have the ability to take advantage of what we love most in our country, which is technology. And we are every day connecting networks to devices. And I'm sorry, but I heard yesterday in another session, and I'm a little frustrating to me, well, we've got air walls, air gaps and firewalls, and segments. It's like, has anybody studied Stuxnet? We blew through every firewall and air gap in order to be able to carry that attack. So the idea that we can feel some type of protection because we have supposedly separation, it's just not prudent today. More importantly, it's not where we're going tomorrow. In my other life, I studied, incorporating new technologies into the built environment. We are going towards more connected, more converged, more IT/OT convergence that just makes us more vulnerable. So what we want to focus on today, what we want to bring to TechNet Augusta, is to start, I hate to say this, slamming heads and saying, is anybody paying attention to the OT space? And when we talk about offensive, defensive cyber, when it comes to Army cyber, are we paying attention to what we need to do to defend the homeland? I don't think so. And every expert I've talked to says we are completely ignoring that threat. And it's not a oh my gosh, my data got compromised. It's oh my gosh, somebody got killed. This is an existential threat. When you look at a cyber physical incident, we're talking about threatening people and threatening property. We're talking about disrupting a way of life. When you disrupt a power system, you disrupt the water system, you instill fear. At that same hearing that Chris Ray talked about the threat to physical security, Jen Easterly, director of CISA, talked about chaos being sown by an attack to operational systems. We're talking ICS systems, industrial control systems. We're talking SCADA systems. We're talking everything that's connected. She talked about societal chaos. You got General Nakasone on his last day that he was U.S. Cyber Commander talking about, well, thank God Microsoft found this. Are you kidding me? Where have you been the last 4 years? Where's Cybercom been? Where's NSA been? Why are you relying on the private sector to find these existential threats in our own infrastructure that threatens our homeland? I mean, is anybody else here in this room a little bit queasy that we're continuing to rely on private companies to go ahead and tell us where we have existential national threats? Show of hands, anybody comfortable with that? All right, so what I'm getting at, and do we count on Microsoft and others working in their own best interests in the future to continue to tell American federal authorities, hey, we found another risk, or we found another 0 day or another threat that could potentially risk citizen lives? More importantly is, are we reacting? Do we have the protocols in place to really operate and manage in the OT domain? I'm asking these questions. We'll talk about where some of the solutions can come in, but I just want to make sure you understand this is the gravity that we're asking you all to consider, and we're trying to bring to TechNet Augusta is start thinking about defense of the homeland, what Army cyber can do, what Cybercom can do to actually defend our homeland from attacks to our critical infrastructure. Has anybody else talked about that and as well as supply chain risk at all so far in this conference? I haven't seen it. We'd love to get some feedback from the audience. If anybody's heard anybody talking about the immediate threat to physical risk for every citizen in this country, and what is Army Cyber doing to counter that? That's what we want to talk about.
So I have a question. How many of you guys have a Fitbit or something, smartwatch on? Just about everybody, right? So what does that mean from your cell phone perspective? What can't you turn off in order for that to work? Bluetooth. You have to keep your Bluetooth on. Okay, so before, last year I was a professor at Louisiana Tech, and a lot of what we're talking about came out of my research there at Louisiana Tech. And one of the things that I focused on was both Bluetooth and Wi-Fi communication. And you'd be amazed how easy it is to get to either the Fitbit or the smartphone through Bluetooth beaconing. And there's all kinds of different ways of attacking that. I don't want to get into that. We don't have time for that today. But one of the things that I was studying back then with Louisiana Tech, back in 2018, anybody remember when we got very worried about Chinese telecom equipment in our critical infrastructure? Where we said we got to remove Huawei. I ran the Disruptive Innovation Division. That's a perfect job for me, right? You can't ask for a better title, Director of Disruptive Innovation. You can disrupt everything. And so my job, when we started taking all this cheap, or I shouldn't say cheap, right? They'd get really upset. Inexpensive, high quality, maybe, equipment out of our critical infrastructure, we needed to replace it with something, and my job was to come up with that thing that we could replace this with. Sounds like a pretty tall order. What it required me to do was get up close and personal with a lot of open source software. Lots and lots of open source software. And I stumbled across something very scary to me. There was one reoccurring open source library that touched every piece of critical infrastructure. It was called Data Plane Developers Kit. How many of you heard of software-defined networking? How many of you heard of VMware, network virtualization? How many of you guys have heard about cloud overlay and cloud infrastructure. Guess what they all share? DPDK. So in 2018, there was a very interesting trend as we started pulling Huawei equipment off the shelf, pulling them out of the racks. Huawei made an interesting pivot. You know what they did? They became the largest contributor to the open source library. Anybody guess which one? Anybody guess DPDK? Okay, so DPDK allowed them to control the wire. Then they pivoted, and they weren't only the largest contributor to DPDK. Guess what else they started contributing to? The Torvalds Linux kernel. Okay, so they control the wire, and by contributing to the Linux Torvalds client, or kernel, specifically the sysfs libraries, that was where they could gain privileged access to every endpoint on the wire. Now, does that scare you? As an application security pioneer, that scared me pretty tremendously. And we started talking about, well, gee, what could they do? And then in 2018, we discovered that, exception handlers were being removed from the code, and there were buffer overflows being coded into the code that were no longer handled by these exceptions that were being removed. And we started finding this as a trend. As we started reading through and as I started looking at a lot of code and looking at communication between developers, remember, this isn't about China or Russia. This is about cyber warfare. There's a lot of message traffic between developers about, hey, we're building this warfare platform and this open source ecosystem that our applications sit on top of. And now from a cyber physical integration perspective, right, we have no visibility to what's happening inside these open source packages. And so I started researching at the university something called rogue execution paths. And I reached out to my friend Kat Wang for help because she had access to data flows that could help me determine these rogue execution paths were building a battle domain. And that battle domain needed to have soldiers, digital soldiers. We call it malware, but when we say malware, we think about things like ransomware. When I say malware, what do you think of? Ransomware, what else? Denial of service? Identity theft? But that's not what it's about. It's about so much more than that. And I think that's what we're going to talk about today as well. And so as we start looking at now with the cyber physical integration and the supply chain consequences, it's no longer about losing data. It's about losing lives.
Thank you, Ron. I appreciate that. I wanted to open by asking a question. If I told you there were between 20 and 25,000 devices in DoD facilities all over, including Pentagon, everywhere you're at, doesn't matter if it's a classified facility or not, those devices are complete counterfeits, even though they say Samsung, Roku, Philips. They're counterfeits. They're made in Shenzhen, China, and they were purchased by the DoD for like $100, $200 a unit, and they're hanging up on the walls, and they've got cameras and microphones. And even if you've disabled Wi-Fi, they still can communicate. And there's bidirectional traffic that we've been monitoring now for quite a while. And I told you that this was definitively happening, and I presented you with proof. What's the first thing you'd want to do? You'd want to deal with that problem. You'd think that would be the natural solution. Now, when we discovered this, and this was figured out around December of last year, in January, shortly after, I tried to get audience with Army Cyber. Had huge hurdles with that because the problem of being industry is if you go into any of the groups, and most of you in uniform can attest to this, as industry, the moment you come in, they assume you're just trying to sell something. You're always trying to sell something. It's not necessarily a real problem. You're telling them there's a problem, but it's something they already know about, and you've got just another solution to throw in the bag. But when you're bringing things in and saying, look, yes, of course I'm a company, I want to make money, but I'm still a patriot. I want to protect our country. I want to protect us from other enemies. And just because these things are made in China, that's not necessarily the enemy that's exploiting these. We all know that our enemies work together in a varying degree of ways, including selling some of this data. Well, we finally did after I talked to a friend of mine who just retired from the Joint Chiefs. Chris got me in to Army Cyber. We presented, we gave them the data. Now, keep in mind, we run through DISA first. DISA confirmed after saying this can't be possible. There cannot be bidirectional data flow to and from these devices. It's just not possible. Well, then they validated. They said, oh, crap, this is real. So we present to Army Cyber, we give them the data, the raw data too. We give them the devices, because we knew there was about 20 to 25,000 we were able to identify that have their EDID headers, which is just when you plug into an HDMI port, it tells you exactly what the device is, what its serial number is, and so forth. We presented this, and the response we got back is, first and foremost, that can't be true. It has to be IP spoofing. Now we said, wait, this is bidirectional traffic. They said, no, it's still got to be IP spoofing. If it was this bad, if this existed, we'd already know about it. And we were brushed off. Completely brushed off at that point. No other communication. They said, nope, we're done. You're good. Yes?
Okay. Hey, you guys know this guy named Alsoy? Anybody read about the counterfeit Cisco routers that the DoD bought by the thousands? So this guy named Alsoy found a great source of super cheap Cisco routers. Anybody ever had to buy a Cisco router? You know how expensive those things are? And so he's like buying them for a couple $100. So what's the mantra? If something is free, what's for sale? You are, right? And so he bought all these routers and he sold them to the DoD, and they've proliferated the DISN. And now what are we doing? We're running around everywhere looking, trying to find these Cisco routers. So let me ask you a question. What's a better place to look to find to identify a counterfeit? The outside or the inside? Because, a skilled adversary, when they make a counterfeit device, it's going to look pretty good, right? I mean, it's going to fool the average person. I mean, we're not talking about knockoff sneakers, right? We're not talking about, I don't know, I used to love going to the National Mall because I could find like a Rofex watch, and so as a young enlisted guy, that was fantastic. But, I mean, we're not talking about cheap knockoffs. We're talking about national security. And so we've got a very motivated set of adversaries, and we're running around looking at the outside of the box. It might be smarter to look at the inside of the box.
One thing I want to add, and then I'll hand it back to you, Paul, is we have to be very efficient, right, with our budgets. And I think China has definitely taken advantage of that. So as we have better procurement processes to give advantages to SPDOSBs, women, minority-owned, et cetera, a lot of times we're also looking for the lowest cost provider. Well, China and some of these other adversaries, they know that. They're going to exploit our fiscal responsibility, so to speak. So it's no longer just about Cisco routers that are counterfeit. They are going to flood the market with the cheapest products that they possibly can, and they're going to preload them with malware. They're going to trojanize them. And these are, okay, if we can't get Cisco routers, then we're going to get connected TVs, we're going to get tablets, we're going to get every single piece of electronic equipment into these secure facilities so that we can later exploit them. And when we did our research, the creepy thing is the closer you were in geographic proximity to China, some of these originating manufacturing sources, the more you would see the infiltration light up. So if we think about all of our sensitive military bases, and the closer we are, Hawaii, for example, first responders to any geopolitical conflict between China and Taiwan, it's scary how much more of those areas light up with counterfeit tablets or off-brand tablets that have just been flooded the market and cheaper to import because of geographic proximity.
Thank you. That's actually a perfect segue into sort of the next part of what I was talking about. We, of course, went through the gamut of trying to get into Army Cyber. They were the natural first step for us. Went to CISA outside of the military because this isn't just a DoD problem. This exists, we found, at every national lab. We found at our nuclear power plants, Congress, a couple FBI facilities, including one in West Virginia, which really shouldn't, because that's where all of our background checks are done. And there's a whole lot of these places that we found, just with the smart TVs, we found these were a problem. And when we went to CISA, we explained it. The first thing I heard again was, if this was a real problem, we would know about it. And I got brushed off. Even though we provided data, told them, please talk to our contact at DISA. Tracy will help you out, help you understand the lay of the land, how this is working. And the real problem with these TVs isn't just that they're listening to you and reporting back to an enemy what you're saying, what you're doing, but it's also that they're injecting malware through all of your systems. If you have an ATAC or WinTAC tablet, it'll be compromised. If you plug into these devices, it'll be compromised. And we were told, well, it's just too hard to find them. One of the Air Force bases we were talking to, they said, look, we're willing to do this because we wrote a report on a bunch of machines they have that were using some commonalities that allowed for a person literally to sit out in a parking lot and pull plans for our aircraft right off of machines that make them. And so we wrote a report on that. They said, okay, so we definitely trust you, we believe in you, so we're going to try and find the 14 devices you say are on our facility. And they couldn't find them because it's really hard to find something when the serial numbers on the outside are saying, hey, this is a real thing. You have to literally search for every serial number and match it to a product. That's a real hard thing to do on an entire base. So we actually took some of our own money and we created a device that literally just plugs in. This is our alpha model. Oh, no, it's not ugly. This is a thing of beauty to me because this is the alpha model. And I call it the alpha model because it's the first version that worked. That's why I wanted to bring it. No one wants to see something in a pretty case when it's the first of its generation, right? We do have some things that are release candidate that'll be a lot smaller. They'll probably be about this size. This way they can plug in. You can also use an extender to plug into the HDMI port. But the whole idea is this plugs into the HDMI. It doesn't touch a network. It just interrogates the EDIT header. And we've tested on a number of devices, including some we intentionally compromised to see how this would work. And the funniest thing last night is Ron and I are staying in the same Airbnb. I don't typically watch a lot of TV, but there's a Roku TV in there. I was like, well, let's just plug it in and see. I just want to see it say, hey, this thing's all clear or whatever, and we'll rock on. Within about 20 seconds of plugging it in, the red light comes on. Guess what it says? This is a counterfeit device. Do not use. So now, of course, we know our device works, and we go to look up the serial number that's in the EDIT header, which doesn't match the one on the outside of the TV, and we can't find any of them related to the Philips Roku. And yet, it's a refurbished version. It was either purchased from Sam's Club, Walmart, or Amazon. That's all we know. And they got it for around $100 to $150, which makes sense for an Airbnb. You're going to buy the cheap stuff and put it in. It's the same thing we do in the government facilities. So needless to say, that TV is unplugged, and it's facing the wall. But I can't steal their TV, even though I really wish I could. I was half tempted to go buy them a new TV. Yeah, please. But long story short on that one is that this is a pervasive problem that doesn't just affect us as the folks who are on the front line of cyber. It affects every individual. And so we have to deal with the problem. First and foremost, we have to have a solution, which we've put together several very smart ways of doing this, of interrogating the devices, one, being able to plug things in to know something's a problem. Two, the next step is to figure out what malware, but also getting all of these counterfeit devices. They're not just TVs, there's other devices that are counterfeit, getting them out of our facilities into a centralized place that's got a Faraday cage and is air-gapped, all those wonderful things so we can rip them apart because we don't know the chips that are in these. We don't know what else is there. And the methodology of waiting for someone to fire the gun doesn't work. We've seen that over and over again, and we actually have to take action before the attack happens because we don't know if the attack's already started. How many of our plane parts have been compromised and now are out of tolerance? How many of our tank parts are now out of tolerance because of injected code? How many times have a conversation you've had in confidence, the one TV they found was in the general's private conference room, how many conversations did they have in that room, this base, that are now sitting in the hands of Iran, Russia, China, North Korea, you name it? All of them. That's actually the answer. All of them. And if you've been infected by this malware, which we don't know all the malware to look for yet, because we haven't been able to rip these things apart, then you've got a significant issue. And Lucian, I think that's a good segue to your part.
Well, actually, what I wanted to do more than anything else, first of all, it's an amazing story, and I can't imagine why we would have counterfeit devices in Augusta, Georgia. What would be in Augusta, Georgia that would want somebody to survey what's going on in rooms? I have no idea. Yeah, and yeah. So, but more than anything else, Paul, I want to give you some solace and some comfort, and that is, I know you've gone in to see Cybercom, you've gone in to see Army Cyber, you haven't getting a lot of response. Congress has done the same thing. Congress actually passed legislation in FY22. It's called Section 1505. We'd love for you all to write it down. We specifically call for the Department of Defense to map OT terrain at just their critical assets, not entire enterprise. Those critical assets are known euphemistically in the building as DCAs and TCAs. So we're talking about the assets that have been determined to be of vital national importance for them to be secure and safe. That was a requirement by Congress to map the OT terrain. So that's exactly what we're talking about, the devices, the terrain that these assets rely on. Guess how much progress has been done on 1505 in 2 years? Zero, none. So it's not just you that's being turned away. Congress is being turned away. Sure thing. And yet, because, one last thing. I tried to get in to talk to U.S. Cybercom, particularly asking, okay, who's in charge, who's leading the charge on 1505? The entire command has no idea who's in charge. They think it's 3.6, maybe somebody in 3.6, but even an entire United States command that has no idea on how to map OT terrain.
I promised I'd poke fingers and eyes, and I like doing that for a reason. It's not because I'm trying to be a jerk. It's because we need to change how we think about these problems. I did, of course, try and contact members of Congress. Specifically, there is a Senate committee for cybersecurity, and there's a subcommittee for cybersecurity in the House. The response I got back is, unfortunately, I live in Florida. I'm just north of Orlando, so none of my representatives are on the committees. So when I reached out to, I'll use the example Nancy Mace, since we're close to South Carolina. I reached out to her. She's the chairperson for the subcommittee for cybersecurity for the House. I was told by her staff I'm not a constituent, therefore it's going to be very hard, if not impossible, to get me in. And that, to me, is completely unacceptable. We have these committees for a reason. And when there are legitimate problems, and they're giving you, contact this other person in government that you can trust at DISA to show this is legit. Contact these people in the Air Force now who are in the process of helping us get this fully into fruition, because we need a place to test and get accredited. When we think about that, those are the two people we're helping, but we're literally picking leaves off a tree trying to kill it, and that's just never going to happen. What we need is the full support of military, the other government entities. We need full support of Congress to be able to make this change. And that's true for a lot of the other problems you'll hear. This is just one of many cybersecurity challenges that I've heard over the last couple of days and probably hear until tomorrow. But unless we look at these differently, unless we look at that OT environment as being completely different, we're never going to solve it, because we're trying to solve it from an IT solution. I hear firewalls. I hear, oh, we turn those devices off. Are you kidding me? Look up a company called Hack5. They make the pen test kits that we use. Routinely, I have people tell me they've turned everything off. And just by using their proprietary Ducky script, I can turn them right back on. I can turn your cameras on. Yeah, please.
I love that. I mean, so here's the thing to know. I came from a telecom, right? Do you know what the telecom goal for these devices that I was creating in order to be telecom grade? They had to be 48 gigabit per second. Okay, that sounds like a lot now, right? I mean, 10 years from now, we'll be talking about that like we talk about 2K, right? But 48 gigabit. What's your internet at home? A gig? Ethernet, maybe? Yeah. Which in your Wi-Fi is probably like 500 meg, give or take, because the max is like 800 meg. Ethernet over HDMI, these smart TVs that we're talking about, by the way. So you take the Wi-Fi, okay, so you get rid of your 500 megabit connection. Okay, you disable your Ethernet, okay, so you've killed off your maybe gig, maybe 100 megabit, most of them are fast Ether. Ethernet over HDMI, line rate, 48 gigabit per second. And they're capable of taking, when you plug in your smartphone and throw something on there, or you take your laptop and you plug it in and your laptop is cross-connected with Nipper, guess what it's using as its gateway? That device that you just connected to it. So anyway, sorry, Paul. I had to, because I hear that a lot. It's like, oh no, our TVs are safe. We've physically removed the Ethernet. It's like, good job. We've turned off the Wi-Fi. Okay, yeah, good job. Forget that there's malware that can turn it back on. But we're just going to like skip past that because they're using a 48 gigabit connection.
So now that we've given a whole slew of problems, and I'm sure there are a few more that we're going to talk about, what are some solutions? Again, like I said, part of this is us looking at the OT environment as a battle space. This is a battle. It's an ongoing cyber battle that we're in, and we're not looking at it that way. And we're also not training our people appropriately. I don't fault the person who told me at Army Cyber, who told me, hey, it's always IP spoofing. I don't understand what I'm looking at, so that's what it is. It has to be. Verbatim, those were his words. I don't understand what I'm looking at. Why? Why didn't he understand? Because he wasn't trained properly for this. We're not training people for an OT environment. We're training people for 10 and 15 year ago IT problems we had with Windows NT. We're not training them for the future of cyber warfare, for the future of an OT environment warfare. So that's, first and foremost, it's a training problem. But the other problem is we're in an active engagement right now. There is fire coming across the line. We have to not only return fire with using these devices to provide, this is the intelligence person in me, I want to provide some BS data to whoever this is, to our enemy. It's always good. So what's the DoD philosophy? Why tell the truth when you can tell a lie? Because the enemy's always going to hear what you say. I love that. That's exactly what we need to be sending through these devices right now. We need to make sure they can't trust the information that they're receiving. But we also need to gather these up, find them, and get them out of our systems. Figure out all the malware. And then we have to address that, and we have to figure out how to get that out of our systems. We can't go back to doing things with pen and paper. Yes, there are some areas that that's all they do, and I get that, and I understand exactly why, but we can't do that as a rule. We still have to move forward, but we can't fight our wars the same way we did 10 years ago, 20 years ago, or 50 or 100 years ago. We have to be doing what China's doing, and we have to look forward 50 years and say, what's the war we want to fight, because that's the one we can win, and let's structure it that way. And if we're not looking at that, if we're not saying, how do we put a 50-year plan that not only gets us out of this hole we've dug ourselves into and for some reason keep digging, and that's the first rule of holes, when you find yourself in one, stop digging. We need to stop digging. We need to look for the way out. We need to fix the problem. And then we need to figure out how we're going to do something similar, because this is an active engagement, whether we want to admit it or we want to deal with it or not. And at some point, I would say let's give a hypothetical. China invades Taiwan. We know that's a probable at some point, their own words. Well, what's the first thing you would do if you want to keep us out of that engagement? You're going to shut off our forces. You're going to kill our power grid. You're going to ground our aircraft, make sure our missiles, we can't trust them. Make sure there are failures in our systems and our communications capability. They shut off our comms, what can we do? Pretty much nothing. If they already know our battle plans to counter anything they do, well, if you knew everyone's battle plan, you always win. That's the cheat code. Well, they have that cheat code right now. So that's one of the challenges. So from a solutions aspect, I'm going to hand it over to Lucian in a moment because I know he's got a bunch as well. But the solutions aren't hard. Well, yeah, they are. It takes a lot of people and it takes a lot of talent. But it's not hard from a sense of what to do. We know what to do. We just need people to take it seriously and allow us to take those actions. Us is all of us, not just my company or his, hers, or any of the other ones here, or any of the groups of people who are here. It's all of us that need to work together on this one. But Lucian, I know you have a bunch of things you want to say.
I know where to go. I just wanted to, first of all, I mean, we're blowing through a lot of content here. If anybody's got any questions or comments, okay. All right, starting to get some interaction. So I'm going to ask you to stand up and speak, and then I'm going to repeat your question just because we're recording this, and then we can answer it. Go ahead.
Good question. The question that we were just asked is, what did we find when we plugged into the Roku device? And when we did interrogated the idiot header, what's looking for is, does it match what it should have in it? Is everything the right length? And does it match what that provider should allow? And I'm dumbing it down. I'll let Ron give you the specifics on that, and then I'll tell you.
Okay, so there's a couple different ways that the EDID is used to spread malware. Okay, so specifically to your question, no, we did not find malware. We didn't find indications of malware. What we found indications of is essentially fakery, right, for lack of a better word. From an EDID perspective, attackers, what they do is there's extended what's called the enhanced EDID, and what they do is they use buffer overflow as they're negotiating resolution. So within most of what we connect to smart TVs are Microsoft devices, okay? Because the HDMI port is also an Ethernet port, Microsoft has tied the WAN port DLLs to the HDMI to the video card. And so you can blow the WAN port and you can use that to inject code. But we did not find this on the Roku.
Can I jump in with a clarification, please? Correct me if I'm wrong. we were not looking for malware.
That's exactly
That is a really important distinction. If this was a different situation and we found this Roku device within a secure military facility, I would say we should not try and attempt to look for the malware. We identified that the product is a counterfeit device. Then it goes into a lab, and then we do our Vulcan stuff, and then decide on what the next recourse of action would be. So we weren't actually looking for it.
Let me finish up one thing before, because I know you probably have a follow-up, and then we have one in the back. 100% correct. We weren't looking for that. All we're looking for right now is counterfeit device. And what we ended up doing is we pulled, of course, identified that it wasn't structured properly, and then we did a manual verification, because right now we're still in the trust, no trust, but verify phase. So we looked at it, and we said, okay, does the serial number that it says is wrong, it doesn't match any manufacturer, does it match anything on the exterior of this product? And the answer to that was no also. It was a complete mismatch, and things weren't proper in the EDIT header. So we weren't interrogating that, and her point is perfect, because in any of our facilities, that's where you end, that's where you unplug it. It now needs to get somewhere safe, where it can't, we have no idea if by doing this, we're also activating something else. This is why we're only going metal to metal right now. We don't want to trigger anything that lets anyone know that we're interrogating the device. We just want to look and know if it's counterfeit. If it's counterfeit, by default, it's a device we shouldn't have in our facilities. We have to assume it has malware for the moment. Now, once we can strip these down and determine what chipsets are in them, because it's probably not going to be the same as the standard, that's when we'll also find out not just what malware's in it, but what else have they done to us. There could be GPS nodes in there. There could be additional microphones that we don't know about. Any number of things. Use your imagination. Anything you can fit in that box. And TV boxes, even though they're thin, they're pretty empty. You can fit a lot in there, and it's going to look similar or the same. And that's where we're going. I'm sorry, you had a follow-on.
So excellent questions. So the first question is, when we look at the EDIT header, there are values that should be set, that are required to be set by specification. So if those don't match, it's a counterfeit. If the product code doesn't match a set of known product codes, there's only so many manufacturers out there, then we know it's a counterfeit. If the checksums don't match, we know it's a counterfeit. And the one thing that I would add is that in this particular model, we're also looking for buffer overflows to see indications of malware, right? So because we know that that's a behavior, that's a given behavior.
And yes, we have reached out to some manufacturers to close that out. Yes, we have as well, but they're waiting for us to get a little further down. Ideally, we just want to get devices in their hands that can interrogate from their side. That's going to be a different kind of challenge, but we're trying to work with them as well. Actually had a little more luck contacting them because obviously they have a vested interest in not having counterfeit devices because they don't get paid for those. So it's easier if it hits if it hits the checkbook, everyone kind of pays attention. So thank you for the question. And the question in the back? I'm going to give my answer, and then I'm going to give Volution for his answer.
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah. Okay, so the first question was, why do I think we're meeting resistance, right? And the second question is, how do we get people to take interest in this? That's a good summation. The first version, and you said something right, it's not willful. Let's be honest, it's not willful. I don't think anyone sits in a uniform anywhere or as a public servant working as a GS employee or even any of these companies who has ill will order nation. If they do, well, they're few. I'm looking around at patriots, and that's the people I'm meeting with. They're also patriots. The problem is ignorance. Yes, incompetence falls within that. But that's because, again, we haven't trained people for this battle space, and it's hard to take something seriously. Like you said, it took September 11th for people to take things seriously in other parts of the world that they don't even understand. Even today, most people have no concept of how any of those countries operate, work, or how those people live. They have a caricature in their mind, and right now, that's what we're dealing with. A caricature of cybersecurity, a caricature of what the reality is of this type of threat. And that exists even within these organizations that are here to protect us, because they've also been very successful. If you look at CISA and look at their successes, look at ArcCyber, look at any of these groups, they've had some amazing successes. And don't ever take that away, because that's brilliance at work. But that doesn't mean we can sit back and say, we know this, we've got this. If it's a real problem, we'll know about it, because that's BS. And that's where it becomes almost willful ignorance, because we refuse to learn the next thing. We refuse to listen to the people. And I heard one of the opening statements was, we want to make sure that we're working closely with industry and listening to what they tell us. And I kind of chuckled and said, that's BS. Because every time I've gone in, it's always, you're just trying to sell me something. Even when I have no sales anything in my material, it's just, this is data. If you want to run with it without me, that's foolish, because we have a year on you on figuring out the solutions, but go for it. I'll help you. I'm not going to provide a lot of things free at that point, because it's impossible. I'd go bankrupt. But I'll do everything I can as a good patriot. So that's the answers I have to your questions. Ron?
So I got a question. How many of you think that a smart TV is a display device? Raise your hand. It's a display, a smart TV. Is it a display device, or do you think of it as a network device? How many say display device? Should be everybody in the room, because that's the average answer that we get. But it's actually, it's a network device. It's an Ethernet device. And the display port is not a one-way port. And so to answer your question, the resistance that we get is, I often hear, it's just a TV. So, and I think that's the issue. And I think that's the perception that we need to change.
I got a more basic question. How many folks in the audience believe that you are fundamentally responsible for the management of the car that you own? How many folks realize when they sign an agreement these days, you are signing an agreement that the manufacturer has the ability to get into your car and adjust all features, performance, update software, update firmware? How many folks in this room are concerned that if a firmware update or a software update goes bad and you end up with an unsafe condition, who's liable? The reason why I'm bringing all this up is that technology is moving so fast right now, particularly the converged IT/OT, that policy has not caught up. That understanding what is liability and risk when it comes to a converged society, we're still having to answer fundamental questions. It is difficult to buy a car today that's not connected to a manufacturer. The typical car's got over 3,000 microchips in it these days, and it's growing. So it's not that there has been resistance. It's just that technology is moving so fast, policymakers are not prioritizing. You brought up 9/11. I've been around D.C. for 20 years. Unfortunately, in our country, we do catastrophe governance. And as we do, oh my God, how did this happen? Let's go ahead and change a bunch of laws. Let's create DHS. Let's do all these things to be able to recover from that. Very little is done on leadership governance. So that's one reason why we're here, is to raise the issue. But more importantly is there does need to be a look by leadership at the national level. It's one of the things that I'm working on back in D.C. It's okay, how do we truly take the capabilities of Army Cyber, of Cybercom, and truly defend our homeland from an existential risk posed by nation states to the operational technologies? It is really difficult to get a policymaker to understand that. But it's not hard for us as ordinary Americans. We know what's in our homes. We know we've got smart thermostats. We know you make a decision whether you want to put an Alexa in your home. So you're making risk decisions in your home every day. At the national policy level, we're not necessarily proactively looking at policies to be able to minimize risk and maximize reward. So to answer your question directly, we were met with resistance because right now it's too hard and it's not a priority. That's why I've made the comparison. If I hear more talk about protecting DOTA networks. To me, that's such small stuff compared to what the larger mission should be for the cyber forces in this country. There's been some talk in DC about creating a national cyber force. I used to be against it. I'm moving towards it. A separate military force operating in the IT and OT cyber domain. My personal belief is that we need a named operation. We need something similar to Operation Yankee Buckshot. We need a national operation led by Northcom with Cybercom supporting to start going into our critical infrastructure, starting with defense critical infrastructure, with private sector technologies and deploying these assets, actual deploying capabilities and mitigations into the sectors that we deem to be most critical. These are the types of programs that leadership that will get to your point. We're not doing catastrophe response. We're actually getting in forward to being proactive to the emerging threat. Colonial Pipeline. Remember? That made national headlines in a matter of days. That was just a malware attack taking out a billing system. And all of a sudden, every American on the Eastern Seaboard was affected because of the gas lines. That spawned an executive order within months. What I'm getting at is that we are seeing these incidents. We're just not doing enough to truly characterize the risk and the threat facing the OT defense. Right? Question over here. I'm sorry. Oh, can you raise up a little bit? Open source security governance.
That's Ron.
So open source is super important. It's a way of doing business. We have to use open source, right? We have to keep up with the pace of change. And there's, if you look at Zero Trust, for example, there's a whole pillar that's dedicated to application and workloads. And I love the idea of workloads, right? Because it shows that the government understands that things are changing. I think we need to have more governance from a discovery perspective. And I can tell you that from a governance perspective, we don't need to pump the brakes on the use of open source. We need visibility into open source and its behavior. And I'll tell you that there's two things that I look for when I'm looking at open source. Remember I mentioned DPDK? And I mentioned that an exception handler was removed. What we've discovered is that library maintainers are mostly volunteers, and you can look at, there was a horrific backdoor that was gratefully caught in time called XZUtils. It's a great example of a rogue execution path, and it's where someone tied Lisma, a Lisma library, to OpenSSH. Anybody know what OpenSSH is for? It's to remote into things, and it's included in every Ubuntu distribution, every Linux distribution. Well, this backdoor had propagated to some of the more current versions of Ubuntu, and it was caught, fortunately before it actually was affected anything, right? And all this goes back to open source governance. We need to look for, specific types of behaviors, like, for example, removing exception handlers and those sorts of things. The other thing that we need is visibility into what those open source behaviors are doing in real time, because we have zero visibility. The open source returns an error code. The developer of the integration code looks at the error code to see if things were successful or not, and we have no idea generally. And a good example of that is Log4Shell, Log4j. It's 2024. It's been 4 years, and we're still trying to figure out where all Log4j is implemented. So, does that answer your question? Okay, thank you.
We have 5 minutes. We'll take one more question and then closing remarks on all four. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so I'll give a quick answer on that. And the short answer is yes, come see us. We haven't published any of this. So we publish reports on, the methods, but not the specific data for obvious reasons. Okay, we don't want, those that are doing this to know how much we know, right? And so come see us, and yes, we can tell you the sources. We can tell you the makes and models that we're tracking so far. So.
The bigger issue is, okay, how do we, as a nation, let everybody know? And that is, CISA does put out, I'm hoping you guys are on their website. They do put out PLC advisories, control system vulnerabilities and hacks. I mean, that's the basic level to start. But yes, ultimately that process needs to become more sophisticated to address some of the emerging threats. There really is nothing that I know of nationally other than those CISA advisories now. I mean, the goal is ultimately how do you make that more robust?
All right, closing thoughts. If you're going to remember one thing, at least on my behalf, it's don't put a smart TV in your bedroom. No, just kidding. Honestly, though, I want to go back to the gentleman's question in the very back who asked, why aren't we getting traction on this? We need to get better at playing the long game. Our adversaries are very good at this. They've been infiltrating us for years now, and we need to get better at it. So I would ask all of you, you are all now indoctrinated into the disruptive innovation technologies. As someone who came from industry, I apologize profusely that there's this horrible stigma now that vendors just want to come up and see you as a paycheck. I would bet money that every single person in this room, game recognizes game. I bet you all could figure out who is a patriot and who's committed to the mission. I would encourage you, please talk to the people who are raising this, whether that be Microsoft or it's us or whoever. If we see a problem and we want to share it with you, please be open to it. And let's find a way to work together and prioritize it, because this is how we're going to win, right? A divided America is a doomed America. And the point at which industry stops proactively bringing this intel to you is the day that we're losing not only the cyber battlefield, but the physical one too.
Ditto. Everything she said. The only thing, actually, let me add one thing from my side on that is, yes, after a year of watching this problem, the specific ones that I'm dealing with, yeah, I have several solutions that I would love to have funded. Whether it's purchasing things to monitor the devices, to actually purchasing the capability for the actual solution to deal with the problem and to strip these devices down, to shred them eventually, but actually go through, figure out the malware, the chipsets and everything. Yeah, of course, after a year of doing this, because I have a year head start on everyone else, we have that capability. And that's often true in industry, is they've seen a problem for a while and they're trying to get it in. Now, I would also say that inversely, I recognize when I was at Lockheed, there were a lot of times that folks would bring me in and say, here's a problem we don't know how to solve, help us solve it. And in those engagements, many times, yeah, we either got a sale or didn't, but in some cases, it was a consortium group that helped out. And I miss those days. We don't really do those anymore. There used to be more of an open door where we'd bring folks in, and I'm not talking about the salespeople. I look at myself as being a salesperson because I think everyone in a company is a salesperson, but ultimately, I look at myself as being a technologist, a patriot, and a number of other things outside of sales. And my first mission is to make us safer and make us stronger as a nation. And if that means helping identify a problem and offering that up, I just hope someone takes it, grabs it, and runs with it, or helps me run with it on that marathon. So that's the only thing I'll really add is I've poked my finger at a lot of eyes because it's well, one, it's kind of fun. But also, it's because I don't think it's willful. I think it's we need to look at this battle space completely differently, and we need to work together to find those solutions. So ditto to everything she said.
So I spent a year teaching seniors at Louisiana Tech how to reverse engineer cyber-physical devices like cameras and smartwatches and all kinds of home security devices. And I was just absolutely amazed at their creativity. But I learned something in the process of teaching these students. And I could sum it up in 2 words. Be paranoid about your cyber-physical integration. And especially as you start talking from a military perspective, right, and an adversary, think about what we're giving away as we're integrating technology from a cyber-physical perspective.
All right, and I'll finish up with how to be paranoid, exactly what needs to be done when you're paranoid. So my nonprofit emphasizes 4 things, and we need to challenge every CISO and every CIO on these 4 things. First of all, CISOs and CIOs do not realize that their data vulnerabilities, their network vulnerabilities that translate into OT will kill people and will cause property damage. But it's not just about data. It's about more than that. So in order to make the case, first thing you got to do is inventory and find all your OT devices on a network. I guarantee you a CISO or CIO does not know how much OT has been connected by other entities to that network. So inventory, search and inventory. Number two, verify that that OT is on that network for a reason, and there are no vulnerabilities in that OT. The Target department store, does anybody remember that hack? Where did it come in from? HVAC system service provider. It's not like we don't have lessons on this stuff where the OT-IT interface creates a huge problem. So verify. Number three, monitor. There are plenty of technologies in the auditorium over here in the exhibit hall allows you to monitor the OT in your system and look for anomalies. So monitor. Number four, mitigate. There are investments you can make to segment, to implement a standard like ISA 62443. For those of us in the OT domain, that's the global standard for technologies, is using an ISA standard. There are ways to spend money to mitigate the OT risk. Start spending those dollars. Those are the four things that will take your paranoia and put it towards a solution. That's all I think we have. We'll stick around. If anybody's got questions, I do need to run off to another meeting, but I'm sure everybody else will